page 14. Masters of the Planet, Ian Tattersall, 2012. The Search for Our Human Origins. 0.3 The Vagaries of Evolution. Let's start right at the beginning, with the overarching pattern in which nature is organized, because this is the clearest tip-off we have to the mechanisms lying behind our appearance on the planet. There is a clear order in the living world. The way in which the diversity of animals and plants around us is structured is not haphazard in the least. Instead, it shows an across-the-board pattern of groups within groups. Among the mammals, for example, human beings are most similar to apes. The apes and humans together are most similar to the monkeys of the Old and New Worlds, and apes, humans, and monkeys all resemble lemurs more closely in their anatomies than they do anything else. Jointly, these primates form a distinctive cluster within Mammalia, the order that groups together all the warm-blooded, furry animals that suckle their young. All mammals in turn belong to a bigger group known as Vertebrata, the backboned animals of fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds, as well as mammals, and so on. Every other organism is similarly nested into the living world, and graphically, this pattern of resemblance is best expressed in the form of a repeatedly branching tree. Ultimately, every one of all the many millions of living organisms can be embraced within one single gigantic tree of life. In this greatest of all trees, biologists group the tiniest branch tips, species, for example, Homo sapiens, into genera, for example, the genus Homo, which are in turn grouped into families, Hominidae, which are grouped into orders, Primates, and so on. As you move up the tree, each successive level departs farther in its configuration from the common ancestral form at the bottom, and from equivalent neighboring branches. And although it is possible to study this self-evident tree of life in purely structural terms, the most interesting thing is to know what caused it. The only testable, and thoroughly tested, scientific explanation of this pattern of resemblance is common ancestry. The similarities that clue us into the shape of the tree are inherited from a series of shared ancestral forms, whose descendants have diverged from them in various respects. Similar forms share a recent common ancestor, while more disparate ones shared an ancestor much more remotely in time, allowing differences to accumulate over a longer period. No matter how dissimilar they may now appear to the eye, all life forms are ultimately linked at the genomic level to a single common ancestor that lived more than 3.5 billion years ago. The 19th-century naturalists Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace were the first to come up with a convincing mechanism by which divergence from a common ancestor could occur. Darwin called this instrument of change natural selection. Once pointed out, this natural process seemed so self-evident that Darwin's famous contemporary Thomas Henry Huxley publicly berated himself for his own failure to think of it. In a nutshell, natural selection is simply the preferential survival and reproduction of individuals that are better adapted to their environments than their fellows, in features inherited from their parents. And it is pretty much a mathematical consequence of the fact that, in all species, each generation produces more offspring than survive to reproduce. The idea here is that, over enough time, those with more advantageous inherited characteristics will have greater reproductive success, and therefore will nudge the population in the direction of better adaptation. In this way, members of the lineage will change in average appearance and ultimately evolve into a new species. That was the theory, anyway, though it has subsequently been noticed that natural selection may well act mostly to trim off both extremes of the available variation, keeping the population more or less stable. Another complication is that, when we think of adaptation, we usually have in mind one single anatomical feature, or behavioral property, of the animal in question, the structure of its foot or pelvis, say, or its intelligence. Thinking of just one feature in isolation, it is easy to envision how that structure might have been improved over time by natural selection. Yet we now know that all organisms are astonishingly complex genetic entities, in which a remarkably small number of structural genes, exactly how many we humans have isn't known for sure, though most current bets are in the 23,000 range, govern the development of an enormous number of bodily tissues and processes. In the end, natural selection can only vote up or down on the entire individual, which is a real mashup of genes and of the characteristics they promote. It cannot single out specific features to favor or disfavor. This, though, blurs the fitness picture. It is, for example, of little value to be the smartest member of your species if, in an environment crawling with predators, you are also the slowest or even just the most unfortunate. What's more, in an indifferent world your reproductive success may not in the end have much to do with how magnificently you are adapted to any one thing. Whether or not the predator gets you, or whether or not you get the girl, may simply be a function of blind luck and circumstance. The upshot of complications such as these is that evolutionary histories, certainly as we see them reflected in the fossil record, are not produced by the reproductive fates of individuals alone. Indeed, in a world of constantly changing environments, and of ceaseless competition among different kinds of organisms for ecological space, it is more often the fates of entire populations and species that determine the larger evolutionary patterns we observe when we look back at the fossil record. And there are yet other reasons for not expecting that evolution should produce tidy perfection. As I've already suggested, change can only build on what is there already, because there is no way that evolution can conjure up de novo solutions to whatever environmental or social problems may present themselves. As a result, we are all built on modified versions of a template ultimately furnished us by an ancient ancestor. History severely limits what you can potentially become, not simply because you must necessarily be a version of what went before, but because genomes, dedicated as they are to the propagation of mind-bogglingly complex systems, turn out to be hugely resistant to change. In fact, they provide the ultimate example of if it ain't broke, don't fix it. After all, fiddling around with anything as intricate as a genome is asking for trouble. Most random changes to a functioning system this complicated simply won't succeed. The fact that changes in the genetic code carry huge risks explains the inherent conservatism of genomes. It also explains why some organisms that look hugely different to the eye have amazingly similar genes. I've heard it said that we share over 40% of our genes with a banana, while a gene that is highly active in determining human skin color is also responsible for regulating the dark stripes on the side of a zebrafish. It may seem amazing that the same genes or gene families can influence structure across a spectrum of organisms that look as vastly different as, say, a human being and a fruit fly. But it makes sense when you consider not only that all organisms share an ultimate common ancestry, but also that the form of any creature is not solely a reflection of the structure of its individual genes. Instead, adult anatomy is the endpoint of a developmental process that is heavily influenced not just by the underlying genes themselves, but also by the sequence in which the genes are switched on and off, by exactly when this switching happens, and by how strongly the genes themselves are expressed while they are active. This multi-layered process, genes, timing, activity, explains the apparent paradox of extreme genomic conservatism together with huge anatomical variety among organisms. And, at the same time, it limits future possibilities. For while changes in the genetic code occur at an astonishingly high rate as a result of simple copying errors, mutations, when cells multiply, few such changes survive in the gene pool. Some mutated genes may linger simply because they don't get in the way, and they may, indeed, turn out to be useful in the distant future, though that won't count for much at the time, but not many will produce a viable result, let alone an adaptively advantageous one. For all these reasons, radical makeovers of the basic structures of heredity are simply not in the cards. Page 18.